First of all, we really want to thank you for participating in our September Art Dare. Congratulations for being the class that won the Art Teacher's Prize. Myself and the Art Prof staff, we were really excited to see all of your different drawings, the incredible range of different expressions and charcoal techniques that you guys showed. We thought was really impressive. So great job on the Art Dare. What we're going to do now is I'm going to go through and I'm going to critique each of your individual submissions for your class critique. And I'm hoping that you guys will be able to get a different point of view and perspective on some of your work. What I first noticed about this drawing is how strong and solid the telephone booth appears. I think you've done such a great job of really observing some of the architectural elements of that structure, and that really comes across so convincingly. The other thing that I really like about this piece is that it really seems like you were able to create very much an environment for the telephone booth to exist within. For example, you have the tree on the left-hand side, which is actually a really nice contrast against the telephone booth, because the tree is so sort of organic and natural. And then on the other hand, you also have this small staircase on the upper right-hand corner. And I really like that as an element in the environment, because what that does is it makes the telephone booth look very large. So the telephone booth really kind of feels like it's in the foreground. And then because the staircase on the upper right is so tiny, it really feels like it's very far away. So I think between the tree and the telephone booth and the staircase on the upper right-hand corner, you've really developed a very convincing sense of spatial depth throughout the piece. So I think that's very successful. I like the fact that the telephone booth has a little bit of color into it, because I think, first of all, that gives the phone booth a lot of emphasis. It's sort of the first thing that you notice. But I do think it would be a good idea to maybe have a couple other areas of the drawing that have maybe a little hint of color. I don't think that the color needs to be necessarily as highly saturated or as concentrated as the telephone booth, because obviously you don't want to take away too much attention from that area. But I think maybe like a little touch of brown, a little bit of green maybe at the bottom, and I might rethink some of the kind of splotchy ink areas that are all over it. Perhaps that was put in as kind of a way to show texture in the piece, but at least right now I sort of feel like it feels like a little bit more of a mistake. And so maybe a better way to do that would be to maybe kind of fill larger areas with watercolor, and then those kind of bigger areas of space won't feel so empty. I mean, another thing I might think about too is maybe just kind of cropping the lower area of the piece, because really the vast majority of this image, it's really concentrated in the middle. And so I don't think you'd lose a lot if you kind of just cut the little bottom area. But I think it's a very sophisticated piece. I think you have a lot of elements going on, and you've done a very nice job of balancing them together. I think what's really great about this painting is the way you fully embrace the color. What I see a lot with students who don't have a lot of experience working with color is that a lot of students are really afraid of color, and they're afraid to use really bold, really highly saturated, intense colors. And so what I see a lot is people will kind of make a black and white image and they'll add like a little touch of color, but that's kind of it. And what I love about your piece is that the color is really this incredible kind of dynamic explosion. I think especially in the sky, that's the area that I'm really attracted to, because not only do you have such a wonderful sense of color in that area, but I also think the way you've done the brushwork, the way it's very bold, and it really has a lot of energy to it, I think is exceptionally well done. I think the area of the painting that I might reconsider is the way that you've articulated the houses, because I think the houses are really important in terms of showing scale, because without the houses, we really don't have a sense of how large that landscape is. But I think the problem I have with the houses is that you have this very kind of super bold, sort of thick black outline that's around all of the houses, and that doesn't really exist anywhere else in the painting. Like, for example, in the lower area where the water is, you do have that kind of painterly, kind of brush-like use in the piece, which I think really fits the sky very well. And so for me, that kind of dark, really bold black outline of the houses feels a little bit out of place. And so I'm sort of wondering, especially because it is a painting and you can go back and work in on it, that maybe you could go back and maybe just add a couple strokes, maybe just kind of push down some of those really dark outlines and get maybe the houses to be a little bit more in kind of the same language as the rest of the piece. And I think that could work out really well. The other thing that I really am happy that you did is that you showed the reflections of the houses into the water. And I think that's a detail that I think a lot of people just wouldn't bother to do. And I think the fact that you added them into the piece really shows a lot of depth. And it really gives us kind of a different sense of surface throughout the entire piece. We really get a sense that the island that the houses are sitting on feels very solid, but then there's this kind of transparent, kind of watery fluidity that's going on in the bottom area, which I think is really effective. What really strikes me about this self-portrait is I think it has a beautiful atmospheric quality to it. I think that overall the drawing has a wonderful kind of softness to it. It feels like a very gentle portrait, and I think that's really great because oftentimes what I see with portraits is people just kind of describe what the person looks like, and they don't really talk about the person's character or kind of demeanor. And I really feel like what you've done so successfully with this drawing is through the softness of your handling of the charcoal technique, you've really done such a nice job, I think, of really showing this person's kind of gentle, delicate demeanor. So I think really excellent job in that area. What I would reconsider with this piece is the composition. So in other words, the placement of the figure. I think what I see a lot is a lot of students don't take that under consideration because they get really wrapped up in articulating the face and the hair and stuff like that in the portrait. But I think what I see in terms of the composition is that the face, the neck, and the shoulders, they're pretty much right in the middle of the page. And so I think what I would consider is making the face a little bit more off center. And I would definitely continue the shoulders all the way to the edge of the page because it's what you've drawn already. It's so detailed and so lovely that it's a little bit strange that the bottom part of the shoulders, it just kind of stops. It's like the drawing just kind of ended at that point. And so I would either go all the way to the edge of the page or just, you know, this is even easier, just take a pair of scissors and just kind of crop that edge. And then maybe think about having the head kind of off center. So that way the width of the left-hand side of the background and the right-hand side of the background aren't exactly the same. So if you have the head a little bit over to the left, a little bit over to the right, maybe you even want to take the head and put it in the upper right-hand corner. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. But I think definitely when you're working with a portrait, it's so important to think about where you put that face. And one way you can do that is to make thumbnail sketches, do little tiny 4-inch by 6-inch pencil sketches. Then you can kind of work out different possibilities, different ways you can place the portrait, and I think that would be a really good way to improve the piece. But I think overall what I'm seeing really successful in your piece is a very kind of sensitive, delicate touch with the material, which I think is hard to do. Charcoal is a really kind of blunt material. It can be kind of awkward, a little bit klutzy, and you obviously have a lot of control over it, which I think you've done very well. What I notice about this portrait right away is I think you've done such a great job of really pushing the lighting situation in this drawing. I think it's really evident to me when I look at this portrait that you have the highlight on the left-hand side of the face and you have the shadow on the right-hand side of the face. And I think that's done very successful because lighting and shadow, they're so important when you want to show form and volume, when you really want to make something look a lot more present and three-dimensional. And you've been so clear about that. I think sometimes when I look at a portrait, I'm not totally certain exactly where the light is coming from, or sometimes the lighting is coming from multiple directions, and so it gets a little bit confusing. But I think you've been so kind of straightforward and kind of bold about the lighting that I don't even kind of question it even for a minute. So I think you did a great job in that area. I think what I'd be careful about in this piece is probably the eyelids in relation to the pupils, because I think what I see a lot of times with portraits is people don't pay enough attention to the eyelids, because really most of the time the pupils, they're kind of tucked underneath the eyelids. And so most of the time you won't see the entire circle of the pupil. In fact, usually part of it's kind of covered by the eyelid. And so I guess what I'm seeing in this portrait is that the eyelids aren't really emphasized enough. And so what happens is that the pupils look really, really large. And so you almost have this kind of deer in the headlights kind of appearance to the portrait. So I think I would just say next time you're working on a portrait, try to be really conscious about the shape of the eyelid and how those pupils really kind of insert themselves underneath. The other thing I think about is the lips, because I think that while the placement of the lips is very good and you've done a very good job of making a good proportion with the lips, I think the problem I have with the lips is they're very outliney, whereas the rest of your drawing is so much about the tone. You know, you've done such a great job with the shadows that it seems a little strange that the mouth would be so outlined. So I would just say, when you're drawing a portrait, be very conscious of lighting even on very particular facial features. So even on a lip, you will see an area of highlight, you will see areas of shadow, and if you make that consistent with the lighting that's on the face, you can create a really beautiful, very convincing volumetric sense of space. The other thing that I think you've done very well is I think you've really composed the piece well. I like the fact that you've cropped the upper section of the forehead. I think sometimes people think when they're doing a portrait they have to include the entire face, so I think that was a very good choice. I think also the fact that the face is in the upper right hand corner. It's not kind of the typical response that we usually see when people are composing a portrait, so I think you did a great job with that. This collage I think is so exciting because I feel like it's a really loud, kind of almost confrontational piece that just kind of immediately grabs your attention. Like I could just kind of imagine that if I was in a room and there were a whole bunch of art pieces on the wall and I saw this piece on the wall, I feel like I would just run right to this piece. It's a piece which really grabs your attention right away. And I think a big part of it is, first of all, it's a very complicated piece. You have so many different components to it. There's a lot of color. There's also kind of the glitz and glamour of the gold and the glitter in the center, which I think is very mesmerizing in a way. And so I'm really excited about how kind of bold you were with the materials, that you didn't seem to shy away about anything. There's something really kind of assertive about the way that you've kind of constructed all of the various parts of this piece together. At the same time, though, I think what I would be conscious about is kind of overwhelming your viewer too much. And so one thing you could think about is when you're making a composition that you kind of can think about yourself almost like you're a movie director, that there are certain parts of the piece that you want to be kind of front and center stage. You want parts of the piece that are kind of in the background and kind of less important. And I kind of feel like the balance in this piece is almost a little bit too much. It's almost like everything in the piece is kind of screaming for our attention. And I think one way you could think about it is to say, okay, well, what do I really want to call attention to? And what's maybe an area that I could kind of push down a little bit, make it a little bit less prominent? I mean, I think one thing that might help you is to make this a mixed media piece. So in addition to all the collaging that you're doing, maybe what you could do after the collage dries is get some acrylic paint and then paint over some of those areas, because that would be a quick way to kind of subdue some areas, kind of fix up some of the transitions, so that way the collage maybe isn't quite so evident. But I think it's an exciting piece. I think it's definitely a piece that I want to spend time with. I want to kind of figure out what it's about. I'm looking at all the different images. I'm kind of asking myself, what do they have to do with each other? It's certainly a piece that I think really kind of piques your curiosity. And I think that's great, because I think sometimes you'll look at an art piece and you'll just kind of know right away what it is because it's so literal. And I really feel like this is one of those pieces where I need to spend time with it. I want to think about what it is and I want to consider all of those different factors. I think what's so beautifully accomplished in this watercolor painting is the landscape far away in the background in the trees, and then moving forward into the foreground with the car. And I have to say, your watercolor technique is so beautiful. It's really subtle, it's super sensitive, and actually the contrast is not that high. It's not like you have super dark darks and a really bright white. It's actually a lot more subtle than that, and I think that's why I really appreciate it. And I really feel like you did such a really nice job of mixing so many different kind of variations of green. I think especially in the lower section of the piece, you have so many different kind of variations on green, greens that are more yellow, greens that are a little bit more brown. And so I find myself really quickly kind of immersing myself into that whole area and just getting so totally absorbed by the beautiful kinds of color choices that you're making in that area. Now, what's kind of nice against that landscape is how kind of concrete and kind of stiff and bold the truck becomes, because the darkness of the blue in the truck, I think, is a really nice contrast against kind of how airy and atmospheric the field is. And also you have some very good linear perspective in the back of the truck, which kind of makes the truck look like it's kind of coming out at us. And so I feel like there's kind of a feeling of movement in the piece for that reason. I guess what I might think about with the truck is maybe changing its direction just a little bit, because right now the truck, it's just kind of going straight ahead. And I'm just kind of wondering, maybe it would make for a more dynamic composition if you had the truck so it was maybe steering a little to the right or steering a little bit to the left, so it wasn't kind of just going straight forward. One other thing I might just think about leaving out is the Chevrolet text. Text can be really problematic, I think, in artwork, because no matter what image you're looking at, people always want to read the text. It doesn't matter what the text is. People are just totally attracted to it. They're seduced by it. It's impossible for them to not acknowledge it. And I just sort of feel like the text, it's so front and center, and I don't see that it has a huge reason to be there. And so I would just say, just because something is there doesn't necessarily mean you have to put it in there. I mean, I actually don't mind the license plate, but I think the difference is that the license plate is really small and you don't notice it right away, whereas the Chevrolet text is so gigantic, it's so in our face, that we kind of have no choice but to see it. So that's maybe something I would tone down. But I think great job with your watercolor technique. Watercolor is one of those media, I think, people think it's easy because they think, oh, it's just a brush and paint and water and you just pick it up and paint. I think it's so difficult to paint well with watercolor because you have to really have such control over the brush and the water. It's a media that doesn't want to be controlled, and yet you seem to have such a strong command of it. So great job in that area. One of the things that I noticed right away about this skull drawing is I really enjoyed the fact that the skull is tilted backwards, because I've seen a lot of skull drawings as an art educator. I've seen lots of people do that kind of traditional, just take the skull, plop it on the table and just draw it as it is. But I think what you've done by tilting the skull backwards is you're really giving the skull kind of a sense of life. I almost feel like the skull is alive. It doesn't feel like an object anymore. And I think that's really exciting as an idea, because it doesn't feel like a still life at all. At the same time, I also think you've done a nice job of really building up the cross-hatching marks into the skull. I think especially the top section of the skull, where you've really removed a lot of the scratch board and it's almost like a pure kind of white tone. That area, I think the lighting feels very luminous. It feels really concrete. I mean, I really feel like I could kind of grab that upper section of the forehead. So I think that's really beautifully done. And then moving downwards towards some of the other sections of the skull, you also have done a nice job of kind of transitioning from that bright white on the top of the head all the way down to the skull. I guess the part of the drawing that I'm kind of questioning is this kind of halo of marks that's around the skull, because the rest of the skull seems to me so carefully observed. It seems like you've done such a great job with that. And then this kind of fuzz that's around the skull seems to kind of just come out of nowhere. I mean, I'm kind of guessing that probably you drew the skull from a photograph or from life, and that probably the haze that's around the skull was just kind of made up out of your head. And you got to be careful about that, because if you're observing one thing and then making up another, and you're trying to kind of put them together into a single image, that's really hard to pull off, because inevitably the area that you do from imagination doesn't really live up to the expectation of the area that you had a reference for. So I think in this particular drawing, I would think about removing that kind of haze around the piece, and maybe think about introducing a cast shadow that maybe the skull is sitting on, or maybe creating some kind of background or environment for it to sit in. And then I think then it would really have kind of a beautiful sense of weight. But it's a fun piece. I think it's a piece which really kind of gets beyond that kind of stereotypical still life of a skull, which we've seen kind of hundreds of times over. I can see from looking at this drawing that you have really excellent observational skills. One thing that I'm really noticing in terms of the line work and kind of the contour of the animal that you're drawing is that you've been so observant about all of the kind of subtle nuances that are in the kind of contour of the piece. And so I think that's beautifully observed. But my favorite part of this drawing actually is all of the patterning and the layering, the different kinds of lines and the kind of the strokes and dots that you've put all around the animal to show kind of the texture and kind of the feature of that in the piece. I mean, I feel like there's so many layers and different kind of moments of pattern throughout the piece. I mean, it's really a piece where I feel like I could just kind of run my fingers through that fur and I could really know what that feels like. There's a wonderful kind of tactility to that I think is really beautifully done. I do wish that you had taken the time to draw the rest of the animal, because it seems like at the ankles of the animal, you just kind of stopped working on the drawing, and I feel like I want to see the rest of that piece. Otherwise, maybe you could add something like grass at the bottom, something that would obscure that area. Whatever it is that you decide to do, I just would make sure that you resolve the piece, because one thing that I see a lot in a lot of student work is that students do such a great job on one particular area. You know, in your case, it's the animal, but then they just kind of leave off other areas, or other areas kind of get neglected. And I think it's really important anytime you're working on a piece that you're really kind of comprehensive about kind of giving every single section of the drawing kind of equal attention, because that's what really makes a piece look very resolved and very complete. Another thing that I'd reconsider is the background, because I feel like the background, especially when I compare it to the kind of time and care that you've invested into the animal, the background seems kind of rushed. It seems like it was done really quickly, and I don't really understand what it's supposed to be. Like, it's all these kind of horizontal strokes that are going back and forth, and it's a little bit awkward that when those strokes get close to the animal, they just kind of stop. And so I don't really read that area as being a background that goes behind the animal. It seems more kind of drawn on. So I think what I would recommend is really take the time to find a place for this animal, whether it's in a forest or in a field, whatever it is. I would take the time to do that, because you have such beautiful drawing technique that it seems like that's what I would try to apply throughout the entire piece. I mean, naturally, it's way more work to do that, but in my opinion, it's really worth it, because if you can make such beautiful strokes like that, there's no reason you can't do that in the rest of the background. So I'd really encourage you to pursue that, because I think there's so many just wonderful qualities in the way you're using the line work that there's no reason you can't do that in the background as well. What I notice in this pencil drawing, there's so much attention, I think, to really refining kind of a very subtle contour to the face. Like, for example, if I look at the area of the lips, it seems like that area was so carefully drawn. It seems like you invested so much kind of time and sensitivity and consideration into the drawing. That's so important. I think what a lot of people don't realize about being a visual artist is that it takes time. Drawings take a lot of time to do. They're not something you can just do overnight. There are things that really require a lot of attention to detail, and I really see that very evidently in your piece. But actually, you know, as well as the facial features are drawn in this piece, my favorite part of this drawing is the hair. And what I love about the hair is that the hair to me almost has more personality than the face, because the face doesn't have a very particular expression. I'm not getting really the sense whether this person is happy or upset or whatever emotion it is that you want to convey. But with the hair, I really get a sense of personality. What I love about the hair is that it's so dynamic, it feels like it's really moving, and it's kind of playful and sort of humorous, the way you have this little tuft of hair that's kind of tweaking up into the left-hand corner, the way it's kind of sweeping across the front of the forehead. That's the part of the drawing that really intrigues me, because I feel like there I really kind of know this person. I kind of know what he does with his hair, or maybe what he doesn't do with his hair. So I'm really enjoying that part of the piece. I would definitely encourage you to add some kind of a background into the drawing. If anything, just to make sure that the background isn't the exact same color as the shirt, because what happens is that the shirt is this very, very light gray, but I don't think it's dramatic enough. So I think I might color in the shirt so it's a lot darker, and then maybe move that light gray into the background, because I just sort of feel like, again, the background just seems like it wasn't worked on at all, and you really need to put something back there. I think the trouble with backgrounds is that they don't seem important, because obviously if you're drawing a portrait, you really just want to focus on the portrait, and that's kind of the main event of the drawing. But backgrounds can really kind of work against you, because if you don't address them, if you don't put something back there, it oftentimes, the vast majority of the time, it just makes the drawing look unfinished because it seems like an artist spent a lot of time working on one area, they totally neglected another. So I think just a simple kind of gradient back there. You could even think about doing something where it starts dark at the top, gets kind of lighter down towards the bottom, whatever it is that you want to do. But I would definitely address that because you have such a richness in the tone in the hair that I'm kind of wishing was more apparent in some of the other parts of the piece. But I think some beautiful things going on with the line work and just a great character in that hair. What really intrigues me about this painting is that it takes images that are pretty recognizable, like for example the flower that I'm seeing in the center. It seems like almost like one of those lotus flowers that you would see kind of on a lily pad, and then you have these roots that are just kind of growing and pushing down towards the bottom, and then you have this blue background that I think kind of suggests an ocean or a lake but isn't literally painted as an ocean or a lake. And so what I think is interesting and engaging about this piece is you have kind of recognizable images, but you've kind of rearranged them in such a way that there's kind of nothing realistic about them at all. I mean, I sort of feel like in some ways this painting has kind of a dreamy kind of look to it. So you're kind of taking familiar items, but then you're kind of recontextualizing them so that they feel a little bit more strange. I mean, when I think about lily pads and those flowers, I kind of would expect that if I have a flower here, I'm going to get lily pads down here and I'm going to get the water, but you don't have any of that. And so the roots, I think, really kind of take on a different kind of meaning here. It doesn't seem like this is an actual plant, more as it is maybe a metaphor for a plant or a symbol of something else. And so I'm really interested in that part of it. I think what I would recommend in terms of the roots is I would literally go outside, dig up some weed, I'm sure you can find one pretty easily, and I would really look at the roots because I think roots are fascinating. I think roots have just gorgeous shapes and forms into them, and you could do a lot more kind of delicate brushwork. Like if you've got like a teeny tiny watercolor brush, I think you could probably quadruple the amount of detail that's in the roots of this. I think it would make the roots look more naturalistic, they'd be more convincing, they'd be more detailed. I sort of feel like right now the roots, they look a little bit generic. It kind of seems to me like you weren't really looking at anything. It looks like they were kind of made up out of your head. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have good references. I mean, when you can, it's best to work from life, and roots are easy enough to get. It's not like it's difficult to get a weed and to look at that. So I would think about that. And then in your background, I would think about mixing your colors more, because I feel like the blues that you're using, they feel very much kind of just straight out of the tube. And I think maybe what you could think about is adding maybe little hints of purple towards the bottom, maybe little hints of green at the top, just so it's not all blue. Because I think the problem is when people use color too literally, it starts to get kind of monotonous after a while. And so that's why if you start adding kind of slight shades of other colors, that can really be very helpful. So it's an interesting piece, I think, in terms of subject matter. I think you're doing some really neat things. You just want to think a little bit more about the execution so that that really kind of lives up to your subject matter. I'm really excited about this pencil drawing because I think what it really does is it really shows a sense of place and atmosphere. For example, I look at this pencil drawing, I know right away where this is. It seems like some dingy bar, it seems like it's late at night, there's this one person there by themselves. There's a really kind of sad, kind of somber mood to this piece. I mean, it's interesting that in the drawing, there isn't even a bartender standing behind the bar. It seems like it's just this one person there. And so for me, it's almost kind of a very emotional drawing in that way. And I love that you're kind of tapping into this very particular narrative in your piece. I mean, I think it's hard to illustrate narratives and stories, and I think that's definitely something that you're starting to tackle here, which I really admire. One of my favorite things about this drawing, I think, is definitely the gesture of the figure. I think the fact that we don't see his face is really important, because by hiding his face, we as the audience, we have to kind of invent his emotion. We have to think about what we think he might be feeling instead of you telling us what he's feeling. It's a lot more interesting that way. The other thing that I think is great about the figure is that the figure has this kind of hunch to him, like his shoulders are like up over here like this. And so that, I think, is a very kind of expressive way of showing this kind of somber kind of mood to the piece. And I love all the details, like all the bottles that are stocked on the right-hand side, the kind of brickwork that you have in the upper section. I think all of that is really well seen. I guess what I'm missing in this drawing is a sense of tone, because the drawing is really gray and you don't really have any areas where you're really filling in kind of large shades of tone. So I guess I would just really encourage you, if you're working with pencil, to really use a bigger range of different kinds of pencils. Like if you buy like those soft pencils, like a 5B, a 6B, you can even buy graphite sticks. You can buy woodless pencils that are really fun to work with, but I would really try to experiment more with the pencil, because I feel like the line work is only going so far, and kind of the next stage for you in this drawing is to really just pump up the tone and really give it a sense of light and shadow. I think what's really interesting about this piece is that in the beginning, when I look at it, it seems like a really bright, kind of cheerful piece. I think a lot of that is because the clouds in the background are so bright. You have a very bright saturated blue in the background, and even kind of the pinks that are on the side of the books show that as well. But then when I take a closer look at it and I start looking at the dates on the side, and then I realize, wait a minute, this is the future. This is not today. And then I start wondering, what kind of books are these? And then I think, well, are they yearbooks? Are they almanacs? And that's what I love about this piece, is that I'm so curious about what kind of books these are. And yet you are so specific about how these images are about the future. They're not about the present or about books that even exist today. And so it's a piece that I think kind of takes some time to reveal itself, which I think is a good thing. I think sometimes when I look at art pieces and I kind of get them right away, it's almost too obvious, and it's almost like you feel like you're being told what to think. And I think what I like about this piece is it really kind of lets my mind wander. I really feel like I can give it my own interpretation and then start to kind of figure out where I want it to be. I think what I would reconsider in this piece is the painting of the clouds, because clouds can be so wonderfully expressive, and there are so many different kinds of clouds depending on what kind of time of day it is. Clouds can be many different colors if it's a sunset or something. So I would say if you were to work on this piece some more, I would definitely find some really good reference photos of many, many different kinds of clouds. I would observe them very, very carefully and really try to get more kind of gray tones in between, because I feel like right now, the way you're painting the clouds, they're very outlined and very flat and very graphic. It'd be really nice if you could get something maybe just a little bit more painterly. One artist who I'd recommend you look at, I'd look at Turner. He was a British landscape painter, and he actually had this huge series of just cloud paintings, which were just extraordinary. So there's so much that you can do with there, and I would just make sure in the future that you really take the initiative to find those references so you can really be specific, because I kind of feel like the way the clouds are painted right now, they just feel generic to me. They kind of feel like the cloud that most people would draw if you said draw a cloud, and then I would reconsider that. But I think it's a really good interpretation about kind of what's coming down the line, and for that reason that there is this kind of curiosity about this piece that I'm really, really engaged by. What captures my attention immediately about this piece is how imaginative it is. I think, first of all, the fact that you're merging the sunflower into the center of the pupil, I think that sort of has this sort of surrealistic look to it, which I'm really kind of instantly captivated by. But actually, surprisingly, one of my favorite parts of this drawing is the eyelashes, because I think oftentimes eyelashes, it's kind of the type of thing, they're so small that unless you're drawing a really gigantic eye, they oftentimes just don't get drawn. And what I think is interesting about this piece is not only did you draw the eyelashes, but the eyelashes, to me, they're so bold and powerful. They almost feel like shark's teeth to me. And so they kind of take on a totally different kind of character that I'm not kind of expecting. And I love that. I love that it's so kind of unpredictable. And so in some ways, they're these like really aggressive, kind of powerful eyelashes that look like they're like out to slash somebody or something. And so I think that in some ways is almost to me more interesting than the flower that's in the pupil. I mean, the flower in the pupil certainly kind of adds to that kind of surrealistic quality to it, but I think what you're doing with the eyelashes, I think is really wonderful. One thing I would be careful about in terms of the anatomy is that the eyebrow that you have, it's really, really close to the eye. And so what I would just make sure is that you have a distance between the eye and the eyebrow that's a little bit more believable. I mean, obviously it changes from person to person, but you have the eyebrow like right up against the side of the eyelid, which I know just wouldn't be the case anatomically. And it's hard sometimes, I think, when you make an object, which normally is pretty small, like an eye, and you make it like huge, oftentimes it's really easy for the proportions to just go way out of whack. It's just a lot more difficult to do. So I would just be very conscious of that. And then the other thing I would just make sure you do is that you really finish the piece, because I feel like it's apparent to me that you worked really hard on the eye and the eyelashes and all that area. I really see your interest in the piece, but the rest of the piece is very blank. And it seems like towards the left-hand side of the eye, you did start to add kind of these peach tones to kind of signify some of the flesh. But I'd like to see that throughout the entire piece, like in the upper left-hand corner, the lower right, the lower left, and just really cover that area and make it full and rich and vibrant in color. Because even though the image really is about the eye, you need that area around the eye for the eye to really have a presence. So I would just make sure you do that. I think you're totally capable. I mean, that's not an issue of even a lot of time. It's just kind of a matter of following through. And that's something that I see a lot in a lot of student pieces where people have a great start, they don't quite follow through all the way. I mean, what I tell a lot of my college students, as I say, you know, everybody kind of has to have the experience of making one art piece where they go too far, where they overdo it. Because what I see a lot is students say, well, I don't want to go any further because I'm worried that if I work on it more, I'm going to ruin it. And, you know, I understand that, and obviously that's a concern for a lot of students, but what happens is people end up kind of underperforming. They end up doing less than they should. And so I think sometimes I say to students, okay, this is your sacrifice drawing. This is the drawing I want you to push too far. And then once you've had that experience, you kind of know when to stop a little bit better. And so I would just encourage you to try that in the future. It might be a good exercise for you to do. This piece, I think, is really kind of humorous in a way, and I think it's awkward, but I think it's awkward for a very particular reason, and that's kind of exactly why I'm interested in it. I think the fact that you have the words and then you have the arrows that are pointing to the particular areas of the skeleton, I think those areas, you know, it makes me kind of think about those like anatomical charts that you would see like hanging up in a science classroom where they're kind of pointing out these different sections and everything. But I think what's apparent looking at the piece is that this is not your typical skeleton. It's not drawn, you know, to an absolute science, and certainly there's a lot of kind of distortion in the piece. Like the rib cage is kind of oddly shaped, and the neck isn't really so apparent, and the look on the skeleton is really quite different. Also, the skeleton is colored. The skeleton is very dark, kind of brown color, which is kind of atypical. I think most people, when they think about a skeleton, it's kind of like a very bright, kind of whitish beige color. And so I don't know if your intention was to make this piece kind of humorous, or if you were trying to do kind of a satire or kind of a parody on an anatomical chart or something like that. But I think I might play that up a little bit more. I think it'd be kind of fun if maybe you had some text explanations. And I would think about cropping down on the background. It kind of seems like you have this sort of watercolor wash on the border, and while I like that because it does kind of help fill in some of that area, you still do have a lot of white space, especially at the top of the skeleton. So I might say either have the watercolor so it kind of closes in a little bit closer to the skeleton, and then maybe you could kind of crop on the sides. And so it's kind of a lesson in composition that you really want to kind of plan a little bit more, because I think what happens is people start on the final piece, they fill in an area, they start drawing in this area, and then by the time they realize that, oh no, this area is too big, it's almost kind of too late to fix it. So I would suggest, again, as I've said to a couple other people as well, do a little thumbnail sketch in advance so you really kind of know a little bit better what you want to do before you actually start the finished finished drawing. I think it might be fun to do even more text, like even if you want to add a section about muscles in here. I just kind of feel like the piece is a really great start. It's a really good idea, but I don't think you've carried it far enough. I kind of feel like I want kind of double the amount of imagery and then kind of to see what you can do with that. I think that would be really exciting. What I see right away in this drawing, there's so much movement and kind of energy and this just wonderful kind of push upwards in this piece. And I think the way that you've kind of intertwined all of these hands, there are some that are in front of each other, there's some that are behind, and then of course they're all kind of shooting upwards. I think that's really energetic and really wonderful. Also, great choice to do the white on the black page. I think that's kind of unexpected. I think a lot of people don't think to do that. And it gives the hands kind of a drama that I don't think they would have if it was a dark drawing material on a white sheet of paper. So I think you did a really good job with that. I think what I would consider a little bit more in the future is when you're drawing hands, to really pay attention to the skeletal structure more. I mean, I think hands are so difficult to draw. I think hands are, they're kind of up there with human faces. Like they're just very difficult to do because what I see oftentimes is people don't pay enough to the bone structure. And so they end up making these hands that look too flimsy or they kind of look like gloves or something like that. So what I tell students is if you want to do a really kind of convincing drawing of a hand, is when you draw that hand, really look at these kind of knuckles that are here. And if you can locate these 4 knuckles like this and really kind of show the bone in the side of the fingers and show the kind of stiffness of that, that really helps combat kind of the limpiness that you'll see in a lot of student hand drawings. And so that's what I emphasize a little bit more because I do feel looking at the drawing that the hands are a little bit too mushy. So I would think about just really emphasizing the joints more wherever you possibly could. I would also think about cropping this piece. I sort of feel like there's a lot of empty background. That's one solution you could do, but actually what I think would be better would be to add even more hands, like maybe triple the number of hands in this piece and just like cover the whole piece so that, I don't know, maybe like 75% of the drawing is just coated with all these hands and they're all pushing upwards, and then I think you would have a really dynamic composition. Now, of course, that's triple the amount of work, and I'm sure looking at this piece that this is a piece that you spent a lot of time on, but I think that would be the next step because it is such an engaging piece. It is a piece that I'm really kind of thrilled about. It'd be so great to see you kind of take it to the next level. All right, this piece I'm guessing is probably an acrylic painting. I think you've done a beautiful job with your brushwork. I think especially in the dog on the left. The dog on the left to me really has a wonderful sense of volume and it really has a softness to it. I mean, I really feel like I could just put my finger into that dog and just grab that fur and I would know exactly what it felt like. There's also a lovely sense of light and dark contrast in this piece. Like you really have a couple areas that are like deep, deep dark black. You've got some highlights that are like really bright and luminous. And so you've done such a nice job, I think, of creating those kinds of values. I think the dog on the right is not as strong as the dog on the left. I feel like the dog on the right, the value range is not quite as big. I mean, part of that's the color because it's a little bit more of a yellow color on the right-hand side, but also I think you didn't push the shadows quite as much in the dog on the right-hand side. So I think in that one, I might do that a little bit more. The background, I like that you made it pink because I actually think that the pink is a nice contrast against the kind of subtle, kind of warm, yellowy brown colors of the dogs. The big kind of stands out in that way, which I think is quite good. But I think what I'm missing is some kind of a ground plane because when I look at the painting, the dogs look so three-dimensional and convincing, but then when I look at them, I don't really know where their feet touch the floor, and it's a little strange how the dog on the right-hand side, the feet are just kind of cut off. So I would just say when you're doing a painting and you're showing these animals and you have these feet, just to show where they contact the floor is very important. If you can have a cast shadow underneath or something like that. But I think just spatially it would make more sense, because your two dogs on their own, they're so well painted, but I feel like I don't really understand the context and the environment that they sit in. So, and actually that I think is much more difficult. I think a lot of people probably are able to paint the object, but really struggle with how to put the object within the context of kind of a convincing environment. So that's definitely something I would think about. But I mean, you have such facility with the brush, which is unusual. I think a lot of students, when they start painting, they really struggle with how to use the brush, how to make the brush more sophisticated, and you've done such a great job of that. This pen drawing, I think, is so lovely and subtle, and I think it's one of those pieces you look at it and you just think, oh my God, that must have taken forever. And so what I see so evidently is that you have such a strong work ethic, and that you really kind of made a commitment to this piece, and you really followed through. And I admire that a lot, because I think that it's hard to follow through on an art piece. I think a lot of people get very frustrated, because I think oftentimes the progress of an art piece is not linear. I think what I see a lot in my students' work, but in my own work as well, is that things don't always get better and better and better. In fact, most of the time, they get better and then way worse and then even worse, and then you hope it gets a little bit better. And so it's easy, I think, when you're doing an art piece, when things get kind of tough, to kind of get really discouraged and kind of give up. And what I see here is that you were so kind of tenacious about filling in every single little subtlety. And what I like about the piece especially is that even though you're drawing what seems to be kind of identical leaves on the same branch, I really feel like every leaf in this drawing has its own kind of character. Like you have a leaf where it's just like the front of it, and we can really see kind of the shape of it. But one of my favorite leaves is the one that's like really skinny and thin, that's like kind of tilted like this. And I really like that leaf a lot, because first of all, we're seeing a different point of view, and second of all, it's just such a different shape than what you have in the rest of the piece. And so I really enjoy the fact that you're showing us so many different kinds of point of view on the piece. I guess the part that I would rethink is the really kind of dark set of dots at the bottom. I sort of feel like that bottom area is really, really heavy and dark. And I don't know that you need it, and I'm a little confused, because it seems like if they're hanging leaves, then it would just be kind of empty air at the bottom. But also, it doesn't seem articulated specifically enough that I can say, okay, that's the floor. So I think what I would say is just have a couple like sprinkles of dots at the bottom, and that's it. I think I would get rid of that really kind of dark outline, because I just don't see it as being necessary. I think you have so many other aspects of the piece that are so beautifully done that you just don't need it. And I really do think that in a lot of art pieces, less is more. That there are a lot of things that people will add into their art pieces that they think are really necessary, which really are not. So I think I wouldn't be afraid to do that. But just great job overall with the technique. I think that you're obviously somebody who has a lot of patience, a lot of concentration, and you really achieve some lovely areas in this piece. This portrait, I think, is a really terrific, assertive piece. I think what I see and what I look for in a lot of drawings is I look for a sense of confidence, because I think sometimes I'll look at drawings and they seem almost kind of apologetic. It's almost like, I'm sorry I exist. But I look at this drawing and it just seems really bold and confident. It seems like the artist that did this drawing really knew that they wanted to make things a certain color. They really knew they wanted to make something really dark, and they didn't shy away at all. And I really admire that kind of boldness and that expression. Like, for example, I love that the eyes are so rich and so vibrant. And I think the fact that the artist chose to put in the kind of blue kind of checkered pattern in the shirt is also wonderful. I see a lot of people, they'll look at an image of a figure who's wearing some kind of patterned clothing, and they just leave it out because they don't want to bother, because they think it's too complicated. And I love the fact that in this drawing, that area of it is really tackled. But actually, one of my favorite parts of this portrait is the freckles, because again, that's another detail that I think a lot of people, they just leave out because they don't seem that important. But I think in this piece they really are, because I think first of all, they're a nice contrast against kind of the darker parts of the drawing, because the freckles are very subtle, they're kind of light, and they're very kind of slightly and subtly shaded, and yet they do really add personality to this person. And so I'm really appreciative that you took the time to recognize that. A similar thing as what I've been saying in a lot of the other pieces, I wish you had worked on the background. For example, the entire right-hand side of the piece is totally blank. Again, sometimes just a quick chop with a pair of scissors will take care of that. But also be careful about this kind of strange yellow glow that's behind the neck. I don't really know where that yellow is coming from, and there's so little of it that it doesn't really seem like it should be there. It's almost reading like a mistake in a way. So I would just say, anytime you're going to introduce some element into a piece, you got to make sure it's really present and that it really stays there. I kind of feel like the yellow was like an idea you had, and maybe you didn't follow through all the way, but I think you could definitely either add more of it or get rid of it. I mean, whatever choice you want to make. But I think really nice job kind of showing the alertness of this person. Like when I look at their eyes, they seem like they're really kind of captivated by something. They almost look like we kind of caught them in the middle of a surprise. Like it really is kind of a moment that's been frozen in time. So I think really good work making that happen. I think one of the best things of this charcoal drawing is how expressive it is. It's one of those drawings where you really feel like you understand the person's emotional state. Like this person seems so exuberant, they seem really joyful, really enthusiastic. And I think the fact that you cropped in onto the face, so we don't see the top of the face or even the left, and we just see a little bit of the shoulders, this person really looks like they're like in my face. And I like that a lot because it's so different than that kind of traditional portrait where it's just person, neck, and shoulders, and they seem kind of removed from you. I mean, I feel like when I look at this drawing, this person is like 1 inch away from my face. So in some ways, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but that's kind of exactly what I like about it because it is so kind of unusual and not what you expect to see. I also think there's some really beautiful areas of shadow. I think especially in the areas around the facial features. Like, for example, this area here in the nose, I think is really well done. Some of the creases and the wrinkles on the side of the mouth, I think are also very good. Because oftentimes what I see in portraits is people will just work on the eyes, nose, and the mouth, and they don't really pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the face. And so I'm really excited that you took the time to really kind of recognize that in this portrait. I think one area I work on is the hair, because hair is one of those things, I think a lot of people are afraid to draw it because it is kind of complicated, there's a lot to draw, but I feel like because this subject that you're drawing, because they do have curly hair, that you could have so much fun with it. You could really get kind of crazy and wild with your strokes. And then I would also just say, just pump up the darkness, because I feel like in general, even though it is such an energetic piece and so kind of joyful, it is very gray. And so I think I would just make sure that you're not afraid to really just put down that black, let it be juicy, let it be vibrant, because in addition to making the piece look more volumetric, it's also going to make the sense of lighting even more apparent in the piece. So I would really consider that in terms of where to go with this piece. And this is a piece that I think you could easily go back and work on. I think sometimes there's pieces I'll say to students, oh no, I think your time is better spent just starting a new piece. This piece is not the case. I think this is a piece you could definitely revisit, make a couple changes which are not huge, and you could end up with some really wonderful improvements. What's evident to me looking at this piece right away is you have an amazing technical command of colored pencil. The way that you've drawn the softness of the fur, I think is extraordinary. I think that's very hard to do. Colored pencil, it's one of those mediums, I don't think about it as a very friendly medium. I think it's a medium that makes people think about lines, and when you do the lines, they're really kind of harsh and not very easy to control. And I guess what I see is that you really have such sensitivity with your application of that colored pencil. It seems like you know when to push down really hard. You know when you should just kind of barely tickle the surface. I think that's beautifully done in this piece. I mean, all the different areas of the animal, it just seems like you were so careful and attentive about really observing all the just minor nuances. And I love the contrast. I love the fact that the whole back of the animal is this really deep, kind of rich, darker brown. But at the same time, though, we really get a sense of the color of the lower section of the animal, which is obviously this white fur. So I think you did a great job with that. The other thing that I think is really well done is the cast shadow. The cast shadow is great because it really gives the animal a context. I think what I see a lot is people focus on the subject. They forget about kind of placing the subject somewhere, and so oftentimes the subject looks like it's just kind of floating in the middle of the page. That's not the case at all with this dog. I mean, this dog is like planted on the floor, and I really understand where they are. On the other hand, though, the rest of the piece is really blank. And the thing is, you've done such an incredible job with the cast shadow and the dog that it just kind of makes me go, why is this person so accomplished and yet totally ignoring that background? And again, like I've said in some of the other pieces, you don't have to have a super complicated background. It could just be a slight hint of a forest or a street, whatever it is that you want to do. But I just wouldn't leave it totally untouched because, again, it kind of comes across as being unfinished. It seems very empty. And because the rest of the piece is so well done, I think that calls even more attention to itself. So that's definitely something I would consider and something I would think about earlier on in the process. I think what I see a lot is people get so invested in the subject, and at the very end they go, oh no, I need a background, shoot, what do I add? And at that point it's almost too late. So I would say think about that background early on when you're just getting started, and then it doesn't feel so much like a last minute decision, rather it feels like it's a really kind of integral part of the piece. Anyway, I really hope that this critique was useful to you, if anything, just to get a different point of view from another art teacher about your work. I think there's something really valuable about that. I know as much as I really love working with students that I know really well over the course of the semester at RISD, there's something so different about somebody who you don't know at all coming in and giving you a totally different kind of perspective. And I think that's what's so important about studying visual art, is that you do get many different kinds of perspectives, you do get a lot of different opinions, and it's so subjective. Not everyone's going to agree on things. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2, but I think that's what's so fun about being a visual artist. So I would say, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of you who maybe agree or disagree with what I said, but I think that's good. I think it's good to hear kind of opposing opinions, because ultimately it's up to you what you want to listen to. I mean, I had that experience in art school where I had, you know, this teacher telling me this teacher telling me that, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do? But I think that's kind of the fun part of it, is just having so many different people to talk to and then kind of learning on your own exactly what kind of artist you want to be.